It was poker night. Once a month, the shift would get together and play poker. It rotated from house to house, and this time, it was my turn. My living room was crowded with about a dozen people. 8 of us were playing at the table, and I was tucked back against a wall. We were all drinking and having fun. Cory stops by. He liked to be the life of the party, so when he came in, it was high fives and greetings all around. Now, Cory was a young officer, only been on the department for a little over a year or so. But I had known him for a couple of years already while he went to college and the IU police program. Back in those days, he was cocky, and that night was no different. He started making fun of us being drunk, which was true, and he said he could grab all the money from the table and take off, and we wouldn't be able to stop him. I called him out right there. I said, if you think you can grab that money and get out that front door before I stop you, then go for it. And if you do, it's all yours. Cory just laughed, knowing he was faster than me, and I had a whole table between us. All he had to do was grab the money and get out the front door. I could see him measuring it up in his head. But I had one little piece of information that Cory didn't. I always, and I mean always, kept my front door locked. Cory went for it. He grabbed a handful of cash and raced to the front, sure that he was going to make it. I bounced him off a couple of walls. It's time to start telling our own stories. I'm Steve Kellums, and welcome to Blue Canary. I went ahead and told that story because it is Cory's favorite, and he tells it all the time. A seasoned veteran with inside information and a cocky young cop who went on to be an FBI agent. Cory Grass graduated from IU in 1996 and worked for the Bloomington Police Department from 1996 to 2002. He then spent the next 20 years with the FBI, first in Miami with the Violent Crimes Team, and then in Terre Haute, Indiana at the federal prison with counterterrorism, finishing up at the Bloomington, Indiana office working on counterintelligence and source recruitment. When I decided to focus on reform, I knew I had to have Cory on the show. He's opinionated, outspoken, and really smart. Cory, thanks a lot for coming on and talking to me. I really appreciate it.
Hey, no problem. Thanks for having me.
So when I started doing or I should say when I had the idea to do police reform on the podcast, kind of talk about it, I wanted to get information from those people that had done it at a wide variety of levels. And you've done it. You worked municipal police. You also worked in the federal law enforcement. And I really wanted to have you on. But before we go down that road and we start getting information from you about what you think we should be doing, I'm curious, especially for the listeners, can you tell us a little bit about your background and some of the things that you've done over the years?
Sure. I was an Indiana University police officer for about 4 years early in my career. So I've done university policing as well, which is a whole different beast. City of Bloomington, Indiana Police Department for 6 years. I went back to grad school when I finished that in hopes of getting a federal job, and actually got into law school the year that I got the federal job. So I backed out of law school. And then I did a little over 20 years with the FBI in a variety of positions. In Miami, Florida was my first office. I worked violent crimes on a safe streets task force with a bunch of local cops and some agents traveling the country chasing bad guys. And then I took a transfer back to Terre Haute, Indiana, where I was switched over to counterterrorism, and I was assigned to the Federal Bureau of Prisons inside their facility with convicted terrorists. I did 4 more years of counterintelligence work, chasing spies in Bloomington, Indiana with the FBI. And then I wrapped up my career the last 4 years recruiting human sources in the entirety of southern Indiana with state police assistants when I was task force. So I interviewed people about every topic you could imagine, trying to collect information for Team USA and sharing that information with the intel community.
You know, it's amazing to me because I know what kind of career you had. I've kind of kept an eye on it because, I was right there at the beginning when you got into law enforcement to start with. So seeing you it sounds horrible, but seeing you kind of grow up in law enforcement, it's always something that I've kind of, again, kept an eye on. But then hearing you lay that all out is pretty impressive.
Oh, thank you. It is funny. I look back at the old days with you and John Spur and all the times I probably could have gotten arrested instead of getting into law enforcement. When you guys took me under your wing and kept me straight and behaving myself. I remember a time in Miami, Florida. That's my first office, and doing SWAT stuff and hanging out of the side of a helicopter in downtown Miami. And I had a conscious thought that it wasn't that long ago I was guarding the handicap parking spots at the IU Auditorium in Bloomington, Indiana as a cadet officer. So it is funny how it works.
It really is. And again, thank you for taking the time to come on and talk to me. This season's about police reform, and I know that you have opinions on a lot of topics, and I knew you would have an opinion on this topic. So I'm going to start out with this super broad question. I'm not going to be easy on you. If you were king for a day, or you could wave a magic wand, what police reform would you implement? What would you put into place?
I had a couple different thoughts when you brought up this topic a while back. I would guess the biggest overarching one, and I don't really have a concrete way of implementing it, or I don't really know exactly how it would look, but just the mental health and physical health of law enforcement in most of society in general, but especially I saw it in law enforcement. I've lived it with people around me, people I cared about from a distance, all those things. I would love to see a reform starting with physical fitness. And I know that was part of it when I was there. I know most departments or federal agents, no matter across the board, tend to have fitness standards that are not really, at least in my experience, not strictly enforced. It's kind of a laugh off almost. But I'd like to see that taken more seriously and reformed in some ways, but also including mental health stuff. And again, it's a touchy subject and it's sort of abstract and it'd be hard to enforce that, or I don't know how that works, but I would love to see some way to have people sit down annually, semi-annually, at some point, not just when things are bad, but have a chance through your department, your agency, to sit down and be debriefed. So that somebody could catch on and say something's not good with you right now, or just your chance to spill your guts. And if everything's good, that's fine. Just do that as well. So I would like to see a huge emphasis on mental and physical fitness. If I could wave that wand and make it everybody had to do it a certain way. I don't know how it looks again. That's the hard part. I always say I'm dabbling in politics now, and I hate it's easy to criticize other people's ideas and say your idea sucks, we should never do that, you're wrong, that doesn't work. The hard part is somebody says, well, how would you do it? I don't know. That is the hard part. And so I think it's doable. I think since you have unions involved, I know, and you have officers involved, and you have administrations involved and politicians involved. But if there was a way to strictly enforce some basic physical fitness and some basic mental health fitness, I think it would go a long way. I have used this phrase often, including at a memorial thing that I spoke at, a charity thing here a while back, and I'm pretty blunt. I'm still a cop at heart, even after all those years. I sold my soul to the federal government for paying benefits, but I'm still a cop at heart. I thought for the longest time, I'm sad and embarrassed to admit this, but for the longest time, I thought military guys, gals, people got PTSD, and if you're in law enforcement, you couldn't handle it, you're just a pussy. It's exactly how I just literally thought those words. It never crossed my mind as an ignorant young man that cops or firefighters or EMS or anybody could have PTSD. I don't know why. I just associated with military stuff. About the time I was retiring from the FBI, I talked to a retired state trooper that you know also, just about business stuff he was doing and how I was going to start business and do things. And in passing, he mentioned PTSD. And I said, we in the military? And he said, no. And I said, how'd you get PTSD? And he kind of laughed at me. He said, I've seen dead babies. I've seen the word. And yeah. And so it kind of clicked in my head. And then again, I had some horrific experiences where buddies were killed and things. And I helped agents get help and I helped officers get help. And people kept asking me, why aren't you getting help? And eventually I did the same. So there's a process to it. Everybody has to accept it and figure it out. And I don't know, there's plenty of times that I probably could have handled things better, processed things better, and I was too stubborn to do it. So if there was a way to force the young Cory Grass to sit down and talk to somebody and just know there's an avenue there to explore those things. And again, I tie that to physical fitness. Both keep you sharp, both keep you healthy, both keep you alive, both make you more productive cops or agents or whatever you're doing. So that would be the biggest reform. And again, it's kind of abstract, but that would be the biggest one. A close second in my head.
Well, let's talk about that for just a minute. I want to dive into that because I think you're spot on. I think that's going to be a big part of some of the things I talk about this season on this podcast, because I know I've already got some people lined up. They're going to talk about the mental health, which I couldn't agree more with you. I don't think you can. I was the same way, right? When you're younger, it's like, oh, that doesn't really affect you. And I think looking back now, being retired, I don't think you can do a 20 or 30-year career in law enforcement without being messed up a little bit. I mean, I don't think it's possible. You maybe not realize it.
I went on my way to be messed up. I went on my way to crime scenes with you guys. We didn't have our MDTs were kind of long about that time, but
right.
You on the cell phone and said, "You got to see this scene." I'd go over there and I'd laugh at the guy outside puking, the cop who had a heart, and I would go inside.
Yeah, right.
I tend. By the way, I had a local police officer get murdered 5 years ago, and after running and checking on the fellow agents and the cops that were there, I was one of the first ones there after everything was done. I watched the video of my friend dying over and over and over. I don't know why. I guess nosy, curious. I don't know why I subject myself to that. And then I have found through therapy that we tend to dump trauma on other people because I want you to be in my boat. So I'm going to tell you, Steve, hey, buddy, listen to this. Let me explain this to you. Look, this happened and this happened. It was horrific. And now you're dealing with it too because I want to dump it on you. So I don't know why
Right.
we do those things. It's just, it was human nature. I don't know if I'm a messed up human being or a male female thing. I don't know. Law enforcement, alpha males versus others. I don't know, but I definitely am guilty of it.
Now, let's talk about the physical side because I think that's important. Why do you think? Because we see the videos all the time and we see the images, right, of law enforcement. I've been there. I've been a cop working a good 50, 60 pounds overweight. I went and got healthy again before the end of my career, which I'm so happy I did. I'm getting healthy again, which I'm happy. But I think that's a roller coaster ride that cops go through. Why do we see images of, why do we let these police officers get 60, 70, 80, 100 pounds overweight? They can't even fit in uniform. They can't get out of a car, and you see these pictures all the time. They can't do the job the way they need to do it. Why do we let that happen?
Again, I don't like too deep in politics. I think a lot of it, our society is weak in a lot of ways, and we don't like confrontation. We don't like responsibility or accountability. No one wants to be told they're wrong or hey, dude, you're my personal doctor that I've used for 20 something years. I love the guy. I had him when I was a police officer. I was young and healthy. I didn't need a doctor. A common friend you and I had who had a lot of health issues. I asked him,
Right.
you should be my doctor. And he referred me to this doctor. And this doctor is great. Over the years, as I got heavy, he called me a fat ass. If I went in for a broken rib, I wasn't sure I was wrong. He called me a pussy, just in joking and passing. But he has no problem telling people, you should quit smoking, you're going to die. He doesn't sugarcoat it and say, oh, there's research. He just says, you're fat, you need to get skinnier, here's how you do it. And if not, you're going to die sooner. You're not going to have a worse life. But most people in law enforcement, you tell them that, or any society, part of society, a retail worker, you tell them that, and there's lawsuits and there's discrimination claims. And again, particularly in law enforcement, where we came from, it's important to the job. You should be able to have a candid, friendly conversation to say, we care about you and you're not functioning well. You're not taking care of yourself. So how can you take care of people on the street at 3 a.m. that need your help, or if there's violence taking place or just restraints or your buddies need help? So I think everyone's just scared to have those conversations. Nobody wants to get their feelings hurt. Nobody wants to hurt other people's feelings. People just sugarcoat things. And I see it in my personal relationships. I mean, we all know, everybody, if you don't want to argue with your wife, you don't say certain things. Even if you think it and she's thinking it, you just don't say it because it's easier to take the easy path. It's not best, but it's easiest to not confront it.
Well, I've heard this before too. It's like we eat our trauma, right? And I think we do
Oh,
that
yeah.
emotionally, and we do that mentally, and we do that physically as well. We don't take care of ourselves. I think sometimes, and I've seen this particularly when we start talking about law enforcement officers that get in trouble, or maybe have some issues where they end up, having some legal problems as well. A lot of times they feel like they should be punished. We feel like we ourselves did something wrong, or that we need to be punished, whether it be because of the trauma that we deal with or interact with, or the survivor guilt that happens whenever you have friends that die in this business. And you eat that. You physically get unhealthy and you mentally get unhealthy.
Or you want to take care of your buddies, but you don't take care of yourself. I
Yeah.
did that when my buddy was murdered in the parking lot, local police officer. I made sure everybody had the resources through the FBI Agent Association, even local cops that were not part of our agency were taken care of by the association with therapy and always checking their family and their friends, but not myself. I did it for 5 or 6 or 8 other people that eventually kind of gave up on it too. But I didn't look at myself in the mirror and ask why I didn't. Everyone kept telling me that, yeah, you should talk to somebody too. And I was like, no, I'm fine. Until I wasn't fine. I didn't have any major traumatic event. I just had a falling out at home and realized I was an asshole and didn't like the guy I was being. And I literally went and started talking to somebody, and I got a puppy, and my first dog in life. And it changed my way of life in drastic ways. I'm happily married again and have more kids and say I have the same puppy. And I just had to admit, I also thought, again, I was naive. I thought you go to a therapist or somebody to get help and it just fixes your problems. I've come to realize, at least in my humble opinion, it helps you
Got to do the work, right?
well, yeah, and there's no medicine for it. Like, I mean, I guess there is, but not for me. But you, that doesn't. You go there, they say you have PTSD and anxiety, and you go, oh, okay. They don't like wipe it away. They don't say like, do these exercises and it'll go away. It's just when you wake up with the anxiety, you now process it differently. You go, oh crap, all these negative thoughts I'm having are not normal and they're irrational. And you clear the cobwebs out and you go, I'm fine, and then you move on. It's kind of what's done for me is that, or PTSD or things. I knowing your weakness is a strength, and I know I'm a sucker for kids, and I don't like violence all that much. Sometimes like MMA and stuff's too much for me. I don't really care to watch people just beat the crap out of each other. We did it for a living. I always said when I was a cop, people would say, let's go see this movie. And I don't want to go watch a movie about murder and rape and divorce. I mean, I've lived a lot of those things and seen it all too. I want to see slapstick sophomore comedy and humor and action movies. I don't want to, I live reality. I don't need to go pay money at a movie to watch people in that same life.
So now when we go back, you talked about the solution to the problems being so difficult, and I agree with you. We're talking about very complex issues that are going to require, those solutions to actually do that implementation requires so much to happen. And even if you waved a magic wand, you got to make sure you're saying the right words, right? So let's start with the big elephant in the room. Is just about money? Is it just too expensive to keep our public safety healthy?
That would definitely be a factor, I would say. I mean, again, at least local police departments are run by politicians or appointed by other politicians, and you only have a certain budget and you have to appropriate that budget. It's a finite amount of money, and cops want new cars and new guns and want to have equipped tasers and gasoline for the cars and
And
MDT,
paychecks?
radios, and oh yeah, and health insurance and a building to work in and laptops and cell phones. So yeah, I mean, there's only a finite amount of money. So yeah, cost would definitely be a prohibitor. It has to be.
But setting some standards, setting some law enforcement standards, saying if you want to be a police officer, you have to meet these physical standards. I don't necessarily personally think it needs to be about how much or how little you weigh. It needs to be about what you can physically do, if you can physically do the job. And I think those standards are easily chosen. I think we've vetted those out over the years. So, setting some kind of requirement for that. And then, as you said, setting some requirement for mandated counseling. You have to talk to somebody, even if you don't want to use the services. We're going to make you show up and sit there.
It's a bad analogy, but when I was inside the prison in Terre Haute and would do interviews on murders or big crimes, we wanted to talk to everybody in the cell block, and of course, nobody wants to cooperate. And if they do, they sure as
Right.
hell don't want people to know they're cooperating. It could be a death sentence. So we had, we would call 128 guys in one at a time for a certain amount of time, 15 minutes, 30 minutes, an hour, whatever it was. And that way, every inmate sat in that room for the same amount of time, so nobody knew who cooperated and who didn't. It's a bad analogy because you're comparing inmates, but same with police officers.
But I think it's some of the same human elements, right? I mean, yeah, these are horrible people, and that's not what we're dealing with law enforcement officers. But that same human desire not to be pointed out, not to be segregated, right?
Yeah, no, don't be stigmatized. He's that guy that raised his hand for help. He's weak.
Exactly.
It was. And I will say, I've noticed. It seems to me, at least in my experience around the state or the country, but that seems to be going away. Again, I'm talking to you about it right now in the air. The guy who said it to me right before I retired 4 years ago was a trooper. Just flat out said, "I have PTSD." And I was like, "What?" And it's amazing if I say that to people now, they say, "Oh yeah, me too," and this and this, and so I think a lot of people now don't hide it.
We're normalizing the conversations, allowing you to have the conversations, and I think that's important.
Sure, absolutely.
So the number two thing that you started to get into, I'm curious about that. What was the number two thing about reform that you wanted to jump into?
Well, it's totally changing gears on you. It's a little more
Oh, I know.
practical, but you know how I speak all the time. In Indiana, at least, to me, there's a huge problem with sheriff department commissary funds and some of the antiquated policies that the Sheriff Association in Indiana has a huge, and it's probably other places. They have a lot of political clout, a lot of financial clout. There's only 92 of them, but again, it's a very, which again, I love sheriffs. It's a great organization and stuff, but we see it all too often, including recently, at least twice recently in Indiana, sheriffs getting indicted for public corruption type stuff. Again, not beating on people, but it always comes down to the commissary funds, and they've misappropriated those funds, and there's a lot of gray area. They hire their wives as matrons, and I think that's that's an easier fix through legislation that gets passed on who has control of that money and what they can do with it. Because right now it seems to be a wild west free for all. Even in 2000s, I mean, when you could hire your wife as a matron, I understand back in the 1800s your wife did the laundry and cooked the food, got paid for it, but I'm not sure exactly what a matron in Indiana does these days. That's not a regular function somebody else could do, or that's even necessary. So it seems to be a lot of money changing hands in the sheriff's world with commissary funds, whether it's food, use of technology.
Yeah, let's break this down just a little bit for some of the listeners too, because I've got listeners all over the United States and all over the world. And sheriffs, I mean, Connecticut doesn't have sheriffs. Alaska doesn't have sheriffs because they don't have counties. You get to Louisiana, they call them parishes. The sheriffs, let's talk a little bit about what the sheriffs do in Indiana, and then talk about what those commissary funds are, just real briefly, so listeners understand what we're talking about.
At least in Indiana, sheriffs tend to be smaller departments. Each county has their own department. Each county runs the jail, so the sheriff's in charge of
And
the
they're
jail.
elected officials too.
They are elected, which is interesting. Sovereign citizens I dealt with in the prison oftentimes respect the sheriff because they're the highest elected law enforcement official in the land. They say they don't respect police officers that are appointed. They sure as hell don't respect federal agents that are hired and appointed. So there's a weird political twist there. But so yeah, each sheriff runs the jail. Typically in Indiana, have a smaller manpower but a bigger jail staff. A lot of liability, a lot of headaches with that running of a jail, obviously, transporting prisoners to and from court, things like that. But because they have control of the inmates, and again, I think this stems back for decades, if not hundreds of years. But inmates can buy ding dongs and ho hos and cakes and new shoelaces if they want them, or different type of shoes or things like that. It's pretty limited, but again, it's very expensive too because it's very controlled. Obviously, you can't shop the market while you're in jail or prison. So a lot of people that have money spend a lot of money on their commissary funds. That's one way to help survive your stint for a little while better. Uh, but there's a lot of money being made off that. And again, most of the sheriffs use it as they're supposed to for new equipment or improving things. There's again, it's this very small minority that gets them in trouble, but when they do, it's bad. So yeah, the use of technology. They have some have tablets or entertainment devices they can make phone calls on inside the jail in a controlled way, of course. But again, that technology costs you money, and there's just a lot of money changing hands, and it's the laws, at least in my humble opinion, seem to be pretty antiquated on how that money gets used, and there's a lot of gray area, and some of the sheriffs try to push that and get caught doing it.
And you're 100% correct. As you said, we've got two just recently have been indicted, and even I think one was just recently convicted of misuse of those funds and fraud. The issues then, why don't we just, correct that? Why don't we just get rid of the commissary funds and come up with a different way to do this? Why are we still doing something that's 100 years old? And why are we still have issues with our chief law enforcement officers in those counties misappropriating all that money?
Well, we have issues with it because they're human beings. There's the first part.
That's fair. That is fair.
Wave a magic wand and change again is it probably gets down into people hate change. Political stuff gets involved very much so because those sheriffs are aligned with state reps or state senators or U.S. Congress people, whatever. They tend to run the same political party in their area, and so it's complicated. It shouldn't be complicated, but it is. I think when you and I were doing local law enforcement, there was some change because the sheriffs also make money off of tax sales and things, states that they take
Right.
in, the people that pay their taxes. I think there were sheriffs making, I don't remember the numbers back when you and I were doing, but it was considered outrageous money. So there was some legislation, 20, 25 years ago that limited the size of your county and how much pay you could take and make for doing those commissary funds and sales on stuff. But it capped it. But again, there's still, and like most things in life, there's loopholes and ways around it. And you can, in fact, the one sheriff who was recently indicted had bought his entire staff of a smaller county Blackstone griddles for Christmas presents with that money from the commissary, which is not not allowed to be used for that.
Yeah, at least he was spreading the love a little bit.
Yes, explain that to the inmates and their families. We charge you $10 for some Twinkies, and then these guys get Blackstones because of it. It just doesn't feel right.
No,
He
it
also
doesn't.
had gone on some international travel for training, which he's allowed to do. Again, pretty extravagant. He's allowed to do it. But he took his wife, and I think this is what aggravates most people: is he took his wife, and when he got caught with his hand in the cookie jar on those things, instead of asking for grace and forgiveness, he basically said, I could have just made my wife the matron of the jail and she would have been allowed to go then. And he's probably right. She would have been a jail employee and she probably could have done it legally that way. But even flaunting that in the face of consumers or citizens or law enforcement, other people, lawmakers, it just doesn't sniff right. And it just feels wrong that you can take your wife on an international trip if you simply, again, wave a wand and say she's the jail matron now.
Yeah, I mean, I've personally worked some pretty big, public corruption cases, and I know being in the FBI, that's something that you've dabbled with a little bit as well. But it's we forget that these chief law enforcement officers, particularly sheriffs, because they are elected and because they're in that political realm, are just as susceptible to some of the other issues that we see in the various municipalities and various states. I mean, look at the Illinois governors. I'm pretty sure it's a requirement to go to prison after you've been an Illinois governor.
They were in prison at Terre Haute when I was there.
Well, that's true. While they're governors. But again, as we start looking at public corruption and some of these issues that come into play, as you said, there's been small changes over the years, but there's this big resistance, it seems, to really fixing fixing, as you pointed out, the loopholes that actually allow people to get in there. And I'm going to be nice here. And I'm going to say that these individuals weren't corrupt when they went into the position. I don't know whether that's true or not, but let's just be nice and say that they weren't. But being faced with opportunities here, and in some instances, as you've pointed out, lots of money, that type of corruption is something that we need to figure out a way to change the culture with these elected officials as opposed to necessarily just straight up laws, because they're breaking laws now. So laws aren't going to necessarily fix it. We have to change culture somehow. How do we do that?
I don't know. You actually made me think of something else, and I don't remember how the law reads exactly. But I questioned this law in the past, but it's true. I've seen it, and it exists. But I believe since a sheriff's an elected official, they only have to officially work 1 day a year because they have other responsibilities and things. So when their staff or when citizens in the community say, "Oh, I always see them out doing this or doing that," legally they don't have to work, except for they have to physically go in the office 1 day a year. And again, that just maybe that made sense back in the day for some reason. I don't know. Back when they had horse and buggy and you couldn't get in. I don't. Maybe something that when the laws were written back then, but that doesn't make sense to me at all today. At all. When the salaries in Indiana, the sheriffs make a very good salary, much better than chiefs of police in most places. So people expect you to work. And again, I know sheriffs get called on a Saturday if there's a big event. Things like, I totally get that. You shouldn't have to work 24/7, but it's weird that there's a law that says you only have to work 1 day a year.
Yeah, it'd be a decent rule for everybody, right?
Makes you want to be a sheriff. So you're out campaigning.
Makes you want to be a sheriff. Yeah. And I think that's really interesting. Like you said, you go from this big issue, and I'm right there with you too. You go from this big mental health, physical health issue within law enforcement. And we need to work on fixing that. And then we move over into some public corruption, particularly more locally, more specific problems with some of the sheriffs. But we see public corruption problems all across policing, and that's something that needs to be kind of tightened up. As you said, a big issue to more of a smaller, more specific issue. But I think that they're related in a lot of ways with that term culture that I just talked about. Do we have a problem with police culture today?
I think we have a small problem, which feels huge because anytime somebody does something wrong, it's terrible. But we have a small culture problem that needs to be addressed because it's a big deal. But I had just done a radio interview this morning, and when you were talking just now, I was focusing my head on also thinking we also have plenty of people. About the White House Correspondents' Dinner shooting last weekend, or whatever it was.
Right.
But how many people there sacrificed their happiness that night to be away from their families, jumped in front of other people? One guy got shot, a law enforcement person from Secret Service got shot. So 99.99% of the people don't have a culture problem. They're willing to work out. They're willing to travel with people. They're willing to work shifts. They're willing to work for that pay. They're not boycotting, not striking. They're not hurting people unnecessarily. They're not committing theft. It's the small culture of people that allow it to happen. Which again, I remember you having experienced that back in our day in local law enforcement. It took nobody wanted to solve the problem except for a few good cops that said we don't want this bad cop behaving this way. We've all put two and two together, and we need to resolve this problem. So that's the culture we really have. 99% of the cops have your culture and your mindset of helping people and doing what's right. Unfortunately, that one off is just brutal to both society and to our perception of law enforcement.
And, I think I appreciate, I appreciate all that, because I think that I feel the same way is that, and I do talk about some culture issues, but I think it's fair to say that the vast majority of officers are in the United States are doing amazing things. And, they're not succeeding because of, help from the government or because of their training or because of their departments. They're succeeding because they're great people.
I would argue they're succeeding in spite of those rules and the government.
Oh yeah. That's usually where I go with it, is that they are succeeding in spite of that. So with that said, then I'm going to ask you just one last question here before we wrap this thing up, is that what would you do to encourage all those great officers, but discourage those that are causing us problems?
I think people like you and I out talking often about the great things people do. Me on the radio this morning, you do radio shows, we do podcasts. Again, anytime I'm I'm a talker. So if I'm in the community, I'm always talking to law enforcement. If people ask me, I talk about law enforcement, I promote them. I mentioned on the radio this morning that all the people did wonderful stuff last Saturday during the White House Correspondents' shooting. Nobody would have known most of those people were there working until something bad happened. You'll see the metal detectors, you'll see the uniformed staff from Secret Service working those. You would not have seen the tactical teams by the dozens of people doing their job professionally and all that stuff. So we need to always pat those people on the back. I actually compared and contrasted that this morning on the radio, that the acting attorney general put out a really good, strong statement, starting off with, thank you to law enforcement for your professional response. Because of you, no one got seriously hurt. I mean, the officer took a shot, but he didn't get hurt that badly, all things considered. And then he went on to say, we will prosecute these people to the full extent of the law, and they will be hammered, versus our local community, where we had a shooting last weekend on Saturday, and there was just a lot of political gobbledygook about inclusiveness and people belonging, and no talk about law enforcement, thank you, and hammering the bad guys. It was all just, and you know what I'm talking about in general, but I think there need to be more people like you and I out beating that drum saying, you're doing great, oh, good job on getting rid of that person, whether it's to the chiefs of police, whether it's to the voters, whether it's to the law enforcement family. You know, I talked about a charity earlier off the air that I'm supporting, that's trying to support.
Let's talk about that now. Go ahead and throw that out there right now, because that's a fantastic charity. I want to get that out there. Go ahead and share that with the listeners.
Yeah, it's so one of my local law enforcement buddies was murdered in our FBI parking lot, and I'm pretty sure for the reason that it hasn't gone to trial in the last 5 or 6 years now, but 5 years. But it's going to be because he was in our parking lot. He was targeted for being an agent, but his sister has chosen to take all of his insurance money and any funds they got from that kind of stuff, instead of them personally taking that and using it. She's, for the last 5 years, put it to use with starting a charity, trying to find a path, a direction on what they can do to help law enforcement, which is challenging as well, because, you know, my buddy didn't necessarily have mental health issues, but the guy who shot him probably did. So we don't, so the charity is called Project Never Broken. And the website is projectneverbroken.org. But it's all just based on his legacy. And anytime she sees an avenue to help people with funding or mental health or a charity event to raise money, your podcast, I'll be sure and share that kind of stuff with her. She's all about that. So yeah, Project Never Broken. That came from his dad, my buddy Greg, who was killed. His dad was in Vietnam, and that was one of their sayings in Vietnam in his group. So they use that for the charity name with Greg's badge number and some stuff. So groups like that, people like Shelley Klingerman, that's Greg's sister. Greg Ferenczi was my buddy who was murdered. People like Greg's family are out beating the drum saying, my brother did wonderful stuff and he died for it. Your family sacrifices, and we want to make sure you're taken care of and keep taking care of each other. She opens doors for people with entrepreneurship, for people that don't last in law enforcement or do last and get their pension when they go out and start businesses. She's big on mental health. She's big on, physical fitness, yoga, all kinds of, therapy and things. So anything she can do to help people, Project Never Broken is there for cops.
Cory, I just want to say thank you for coming on. I really appreciate it. And I'm curious, do you have any last thoughts on this topic that you want to share with the listeners? Wrapping it up, any last thoughts?
No, I mean, I've said quite a bit. I just think we need to constantly examine the issues, constantly have an open mind and be willing to make changes. That doesn't mean we have to take every willy-nilly silly idea to heart. We can also shoot down the silly ones, but obviously change is inevitable, and we can continue to take better care of our brothers and sisters, and which in turn takes better care of our society.
Thanks so much again for coming on. If the listeners wanted to get a hold of you for any reason, is there any good contact or social media that they should follow for you?
Actually, thank you. My Facebook page is the easiest way. It's just Cory Grass, CoryGrass, grass like you mow. Or I do also co-own a consulting company that does some active shooter and some trainings for universities like Notre Dame, churches and things. But the website for that is apexdefend.com.
Great. And Cory, thanks again. You and I are going to get together, have a big old cup of coffee and rehash some old times. But thanks for spending the afternoon with me.
I appreciate you having me. Thanks a lot.
And that's the story we have to tell. Thank you for joining. As always, I'm curious what questions you're getting asked. What isn't the news covering? What story needs to be told? Connect with me at bluecanarypodcast@gmail.com.
The Legal Liability Risk Management Institute is the nation's largest provider of liability and risk management services in the United States. Our goal is to help reduce liability, reduce lawsuits, and enhance officer performance. Regardless of the size of your agency, we have a risk management solution. You may contact us at www.llrmi.com or call 317-386-8325.
When the shift gets long and the calls keep coming, the stress starts piling up. You need more than just background noise. You need the Thin Line Rock Station, real rock, real personalities, and a community that understands the job. turn it up, and ride with us. The Thin Line Rock Station, keeping those who serve connected one song at a time.